Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Thinking Like a Lawyer, a framework for teaching critical thinking to all students, by Colin Seale. Narrated by Bill Andrew Quinn. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables present in the print and e-book formats of this book. Introduction. I have never been student of the month, the week, or even the day. I had 80 absences my freshman year in high school. I nearly dropped out of college twice, but I graduated at the top of my law school class while teaching full-time as a math teacher at a Title I school in Las Vegas, Nevada. Even more surprisingly, of the entire 8th grade class that I taught, 74% of my students, who became Socratic masters and prolific problem solvers, scored proficient or higher on their state exam. This number was equal to or higher than the highest-performing schools in the most affluent neighborhoods in the city. This book is about the power of leveraging the same practical, thinking like a lawyer strategies I used as a teacher and law student to fend off underachievement. More importantly, this book makes the case for a new guiding philosophy behind the purpose of education: unleashing the full critical thinking potential of all students. I spent the last 5 years obsessing over one question: why don't we teach critical thinking to all students? My journey to find answers was not an exercise in mere curiosity, but an urgent search for a missing piece in the education equity conversation. When education leaders discuss important challenges like stopping the school-to-prison pipeline, addressing chronic absenteeism, and ending racial disparities in academic performance, the national conversation almost always revolves around closing the achievement gap. But what if educators focused on shattering achievement ceilings instead? After a decade of reforms attempting to give every child access to rigorous educational opportunities, we are still not providing equitable access to deeper learning experiences. Critical thinking is at the heart of deeper learning, but in the scramble to close the achievement gap, we have created an unacceptable dichotomy. On one hand, critical thinking is the essential 21st century skill. As a math teacher turned attorney at one of Las Vegas's most prestigious law firms, I sat on the board for the Nevada STEM Coalition and led business conversations about the future of work and the urgent need to equip every student with critical thinking skills for our rapidly changing workforce. On the other hand, I saw a school system touting proof of its critical thinking efforts by showcasing magnet schools, career and technical academies, gifted and talented programs, and robotics and aviation after-school programs for a handful of students. With the overwhelming majority of students excluded from these deeper learning opportunities, one thing was clear: critical thinking was and still is a luxury good. This is the critical thinking gap, and this is not random. In classrooms, educators often stick to low-level questions because they do not believe critical thinking can be taught, do not believe it can be taught to all students, or do not believe in their own ability to teach critical thinking. Seeing is believing, so this is an issue of how. How do we teach critical thinking, and how do we teach it to all students? Educators get little guidance on the how and struggle with the lack of training and tools to teach critical thinking unless they are part of the select few in elite academic programs. This gap increases for English language learners, ELLs, students who are academically behind their peers, or those receiving special education services. Often, even identified gifted students fall victim to this gap because of educators' misguided belief that they will be just fine. They will not be just fine. According to data collected by Weiner and others, although high-achieving, low-income students tend to graduate from high school on time, they are more likely to attend less selective colleges than their more advantaged peers, 21% versus 14%, are less likely to graduate from college, 49% versus 77%, and are less likely to receive a graduate degree, 29% versus 47%. 1 in 4 high-achieving students from low-income backgrounds do not even take the SAT or ACT exam. When we also consider the unacceptable fact that between 40% and 60% of students graduate from K-12 systems in need of college remediation, we can see that we are leaving an incredible amount of genius on the table. With all this said, one conclusion is clear. The critical thinking gap is simply untenable. We need a critical thinking revolution, and this revolution must be practical. Dynamic speakers at education conferences talk about the need to completely transform education. But if we are honest about what it will take to transition to a system with equitable access to deeper learning for all students, we must admit that this massive undertaking cannot succeed without an intensive and intentional classroom focus. This is why this book exists. Thinking Like a Lawyer is the how-to manual to unleash the critical thinking potential of all learners. This is the practical guide for designing classrooms that you would long for your own children to attend. This is not some pie-in-the-sky fairy tale that you could only accomplish with lots of special technology, expensive makerspaces, and high-performing students. This is the practical critical thinking guide for all teacher leaders, including the ones at the one-room schoolhouse, the Juvenile Detention Education Center, and the We've Got Everything magnet school. No revolution can happen without a healthy dosage of propaganda. That's why Part 1 of this book's powerful but practical critical thinking revolution is all about evangelism. This section features my testimony as a recovering underachiever, defines and pushes the definition of what critical thinking actually is and why it's so hard to teach, and highlights practical examples to show why the critical thinking gap is the most crucial equity issue in education no one is talking about. Part 2 gets into the nitty-gritty of the Thinking Like a Lawyer method, Think Law for short, with practical guidance for leveraging our students' inherent sense of justice and fairness as a hook for unleashing their critical thinking potential. This section uses real-life examples of hilarious, absurd, and did that really happen for real legal cases to highlight engaging and rigorous frameworks for developing critical thinking skills and dispositions. Each powerful think law strategy, like analysis from multiple perspectives, mistake analysis, and investigation and discovery, is followed by detailed practical applications for all grade levels and multiple subject areas. Lastly, Part 3 discusses the practical implications of adopting the Think Law framework. All of the strategies in the world are meaningless without addressing the very real implementation barriers that make any instructional change difficult. Part 3 works through this difficulty by helping educators scaffold for critical thinking, ensuring that these rigorous, deeper learning experiences can be accessible for all students. This section also includes concrete tools to support practical lesson planning considerations to ensure that your critical thinking lesson that looks amazing on paper does not fall apart in practice. Then, I challenge the notion of student engagement for engagement's sake and make a case for refining engagement with a much more intentional focus on deeper learning. This section also connects these Think Law strategies to two issues that teachers are forced to care about across the board: classroom management and student performance on standardized exams. And because parents and families are the most important teachers in the lives of learners, this section also includes powerful strategies for families to use these same tools at home. The changes needed for schools to unleash critical thinking skills and dispositions will be improbable and unsustainable if we do not involve our students' families. By the end of this book, listeners will have the practical tools needed to build a world where critical thinking is no longer a luxury good. Welcome to the Critical Thinking Revolution. Part 1. Closing the Critical Thinking Gap. Chapter 1. The Autobiography of a Recovering Underachiever. I struggle with telling the story of my childhood. When I talk about the challenges of growing up in a single-parent immigrant household with a father who was incarcerated for a decade because of drug trafficking, my story sounds like one of those despite all odds cliches that ignore an important reality. My success story, like those of so many children who grew up like me, is a story based on because, not despite. I was born in November, but I was a child who needed to defy birth month requirements for starting school. My mother did whatever testing I needed to make sure she did not have to wait another year for me to start kindergarten. I do not remember much about my half-day kindergarten experience, but I was not a well-behaved boy. I distinctly remember loving the book Caps for Seale, so much that I would throw epic fits when my teacher decided to read a different book during story time. The only sin greater than reading the wrong book was choosing to read Caps for Seale the wrong way. If my teacher refused to yell, "Caps! Caps for sale! 50 cents a cap!" in an extra loud voice with a generically European accent, which was likely pretty offensive in retrospect, I found it necessary to run up to her and smack the book out of her hands. When my parents separated, and I moved in with my grandmother in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, my struggles became more real. I was in trouble constantly, and my early elementary school version of trouble was a special type. For example, I had a trouble with a science lab teacher who used to push into our classes Miss Liftshits. But really, how could I not get in trouble when my science teacher had that name? Miss Liftshits once made me write a 100-word reflection on my behavior. So I thought about it, did the math in my head, and decided to write, "I hate science," 32 times, so I would have 4 words left over to write, "I hate you too." These behaviors did not come out of nowhere. I was a fluent reader before kindergarten and already knew a ton of math. I sat in class almost every day, and the same routine happened. The teacher covered material I already knew, so I talked to other students and got in trouble. She gave out classwork I would finish in 2 minutes, and then I would talk to other students and get in trouble. Then, as a consequence, she would give me more work. Not harder or more challenging work, just more. So the cycle continued. Around that time, a caring teacher's aide let my mother know that I needed to get tested. My mom probably figured that something was wrong with me, but it turned out that the aide wanted me to be tested to see if I should be receiving gifted and talented services. These services were not offered at my school or even in my district. This was single-handedly the most important event of my K-12 school career. When I tested into gifted programming and started school at PS 208 as part of a self-contained gifted and talented class in the district's Astral program, everything changed. I transferred in after the school year had already started. On my first day, there was a word on the chalkboard, something like green. I looked around and saw that everyone was writing in their black and white composition books. Confused, I asked the student next to me, "Hey, where's the worksheet? What are we supposed to be doing?" He looked at me like I was clueless. "This is creative writing time," he said. "You just write. Write about green." This was exactly the transformation I needed. Now I was expected to get out of my seat and talk to my peers. Now I was required to question my teacher. Now almost every assignment was even more exciting than reading Caps for Seale because we were writing and illustrating our own fairy tales. We had a math lab elective in 2nd grade before STEM and STEAM were a thing. But because even engaging curriculum and rigorous learning environments could not contain my unique brand of shenanigans, I still got pulled out of class quite often for acting up. Getting pulled out of class opened my eyes to education inequity for the first time. It turned out that although my gifted class had only 24 students, the other classes in my school had more than 30. What struck me even harder was that every class I got sent to had at least a handful of students that reminded me of me. They were getting in lots of trouble, but it seemed like the work also came too easy for them. The biggest kicker for me was that the 2nd grade classes just included 2nd graders. The 3rd grade classes just had 3rd graders, but my gifted class was a bridge class with 2nd and 3rd graders. In this Title I school that we gifted students were bused to, educators could only find 12 students per grade level to access this transformational educational experience. Reflecting on this inequity helped me realize a guiding principle of my mission in education. Brilliance is distributed equally. But too often, opportunity is not. There was also another crucial takeaway I would not understand for decades. In this class full of 24 non-white gifted learners, 3 of these rock star students would not graduate high school, and I was almost the 4th. I almost became the 4th, even though I was the best 8th grader an 8th grader could ever be. My classmates and I remained isolated in our gifted programs throughout middle school except for gym class and lunch. Our team of 6th grade teachers saw something in us and made the unprecedented decision to start us in New York City's equivalent of Algebra 1 in the 7th grade. By the time I was ready to walk in my 8th grade promotion ceremony, I was double accelerated in math and English, had high school credits for French, and was in the National Honor Society. Then, all of a sudden, I just stopped caring. I was afflicted with I don't care syndrome. I was the only person from my junior high school to attend the prestigious Bronx High School of Science, and I was not too keen about traveling 90 minutes each way from Brooklyn to the Bronx. And I definitely did not love the transition from my almost all-black elementary and middle schools to a school where non-white and non-Asian students were well under 15% of the student population. I went months without turning in homework assignments because, for some reason, no one raised any concerns about that behavior. I was an African-American male slacker at the same high school that graduated 8 Nobel Prize winners, 6 Pulitzer Prize winners, and Neil deGrasse Tyson. And because I decided to take lunch during every single lunch period, I ended the year with more than 80 class absences and either failed or barely passed most of my classes. No one intervened. The truth was, this school was hard, but not in the engaging way my elementary and junior high schools had been. Those schools had challenged and sparked my curiosity about just about everything. Instead, it felt like this school was just hard for the sake of being hard. In 9th grade global studies, we had to watch Gandhi and answer a ton of questions from a worksheet. My mom came back from the library with the 2 VHS set, and I looked at these videos, trying to figure out why any teacher would expect me to take time out of my precious teenage weekend to watch this 3-hour and 11-minute movie about a dude I'd known about since elementary school. This was precisely the type of assignment I simply did not care to do, and an example of the type of assignments this hard school kept on asking me to do. What brought me out of the funk of underachievement was one adult who refused to let me waste my potential. Ms. Simon, a counselor, pulled me into her office. I had always thought she was just a mean lady, because she looked like she could have been one of those gruff detectives from Law and Order in another lifetime. But Miss Simon showed me that she cared about me by pulling out my old middle school records and telling me she believed I had more potential than I was demonstrating. Rather than scolding me about skipping classes or giving me heavy-handed consequences, she gave me the option of carrying around an attendance sheet to each of my classes as a voluntary accountability measure to help me own my skipping issues. Miss Simon made it her business to ensure I did not become another tragedy of wasted potential. To graduate on time, I had to go to summer school after my junior year. I ended up attending DeWitt Clinton High School right down the street from Bronx Science because my school was under construction. There, I had another awakening. My love affair with every lunch period forced me to take art that summer, and I took it with a class full of Clinton students who also failed art during the school year. But something strange happened. When the teacher found out I went to Bronx Science, she said out loud, "You must be really, really smart." She did not know anything about my struggles, so even though I was generally awful at art, I felt like I had to keep the gig up. We had to make a sculpture out of a bar of soap, and I remember spending a whole weekend, triple the time it would have taken me to watch Gandhi, designing this intricate sunrise sculpture that blew the teacher's mind. She reminded me of the power of belief. Because she unequivocally believed I was capable of excellence, I believed it too. After this, I just kept up the act until it seemed I did not have to act any more. I realized how to play the game and started to play it. My grades skyrocketed. I was able to qualify for advanced placement courses, and I honestly started to love being a Bronx Science student. I decided to do the thing that made sense for anyone who graduated in 2000 in the height of the dot-com bubble: major in computer science. It did not matter that I had not written a line of code in my life. It did not even matter that I had no clue whether I liked anything about computer science. As the first generation of my family in this country, if I could just graduate and get a good job at Microsoft, I was going to give my mom all sorts of bragging rights. I was likely motivated by an interesting mathematical analogy Neil deGrasse Tyson made at our graduation to help us understand his excitement about being in the era of nerds by explaining how rich Bill Gates was. Tyson explained that, given his own role and salary at the time, if he were walking down the street and saw a penny, he would ignore it. He'd probably also ignore a nickel. A dime he would have to think about, but there's no way Tyson wasn't going to pocket a quarter. Using this same unit of analysis, it would not make sense for Bill Gates to stop to pick up $10,000. In other words, it was time for me to get paid. But my dreams of a multi-billionaire lifestyle as a tech titan were put on pause the first day of my computer lab course. It appeared that I was one of the few students who had absolutely no coding experience before deciding to major in computer science. So, before I could figure out how to turn my computer on, at least 10 of my colleagues finished the lab, laughing on their way out about how easy the assignment was. I looked down at my assignment, looked at the blank computer screen, and by the time I scratched my head a few times trying to figure out what seemed like hieroglyphics, almost every student was out of the lab. I started to feel so discouraged because I was smart, right? The art teacher said so, my family members said so, and many teachers had told me so when I was younger. If I was so smart, why couldn't I do this? Maybe I wasn't actually smart at all? By the time I finished having this conversation in my head, the graduate assistant came up to me and asked me if I was finished. That's when I realized there was no one left in the lab but the two of us. I looked at the lab assignment I did not understand. I looked at my blank computer screen, and I said, "Yes, I'm done." That was the moment I almost dropped out of college. I cried on the way back to my dorm. When I got to my room, I immediately called my mom, crying about how someone needed to come and take me home because I had no idea what I was doing. Looking back, I do not remember what I expected my mom to say in response to any of this. I scored in the 99th percentile for every single state math assessment I took until 6th grade, when I scored in the 95th percentile, and my mom asked me, "What happened to those other 4 points?" My mom was really not the go-to person for these types of conversations, but she's all I had. But this time, my mom channeled her inner Carol Dweck and reminded me that my success had less to do with being smart and much more to do with persevering. She told me, "You have always figured things out, and you just have to figure this out. I have to go back to work." So she went back to work, and so did I. I sat in my professor's office hours at least once a week to work through stuff I did not understand. I thought the final project was boring, so I designed a program that incorporated my love of music. The program outputted the notes for chords a musician could play based on the notes in a song. I earned an A in the class that had almost become the reason I dropped out of college. When you hear these experiences, and then learn that I ended up being president of the Student Association at Syracuse University, the keynote speaker for the university's first ever African-American student graduation, an early admit to the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, the nation's top program for public administration, complete with full tuition and a stipend for expenses to complete this one-year program, and later a gap-closing math educator, child welfare reformer, and award-winning attorney at one of the nation's most prestigious corporate law firms before launching a revolutionary education organization that has exploded across the nation, it is tempting to categorize this as a certain type of victory, succeeding despite the obstacles. But my story, like the stories of so many other students who overcome barriers, is really about the because. Because my mother had to make $1 out of 15 cents, optimize constraints, and leverage resources, people, and systems in any way she could to raise 2 children as a single mother, I have an endless sense of possibility. Because, not despite, is a powerful lens for educators to view gaps between potential and performance. English language learners have a massive competitive advantage for academic excellence because of, not despite, the fact that they spend so much time thinking and navigating across multiple languages and cultures. Struggling learners have the building blocks for tremendous academic success because of, not despite, their struggles. Their learning challenges force them to become experts in learning how to learn. Creating a world where critical thinking is no longer a luxury good requires educators to recognize the inherent critical thinking potential of all students. My journey as a recovering underachiever created the lens that I am asking educators to see the world through in this journey to close the critical thinking gap. All of the critical thinking tips and strategies in the world are meaningless if educators do not first believe that all students are capable of excellence. Even when that belief is present, educators need to go even further by making it their business to ensure that we no longer have so many tragedies of wasted potential. We simply have to stop leaving genius on the table. Chapter 2. Defining Critical Thinking. What is critical thinking? When I travel across the country training educators for Think Law, I always ask this question. Inevitably, teachers provide answers with the preface, the ability to, or being able to, show a wide variety of skills. Thinking outside the box, synthesizing information, supporting claims with evidence, and analyzing issues from multiple perspectives are some of the most common responses. I have also asked this question to thousands of students across the United States. Because kids are kids, they frequently give the brilliant response, critical thinking is thinking critically. Occasionally, students say that critical thinking is when you're thinking about ways to criticize other people. But one student response stood out more than any other. Critical thinking is what teachers never let us do in school. Often, educators think about critical thinking as a set of skills that only the most advanced students can handle. This student's comment reminded me of Ramel, the sharpest young man I'd ever come across in my career as an educator. He was an amazing problem solver and a super creative thinker. But here's the thing. Ramel was not a student in my class, and his problem was not in math or science. Ramel was my client in my law school's juvenile justice clinic, and his problem was trying to figure out how to beat adult charges after he'd been arrested on a serious drug bust just 1 month before his 18th birthday. Ramel had unquestionable critical thinking skills that he leaned on every single day just to survive, but critical thinking requires more than just skills. Students also need the mindsets and the habits to apply critical thinking skills consistently throughout life, academics, and career. These critical thinking dispositions are often the missing piece to our working definition of critical thinking. All educators are intimately familiar with this because we have all taught that one particular student who is unquestionably brilliant, yet finds some way to do some of the stupidest things imaginable on a regular basis. The difference between knowing better and doing better is often explained by the gap between critical thinking skills and dispositions. A working definition is even more complex because even when students have the skills and dispositions, critical thinking tends to be extremely context-dependent. How often do students who rock it out in math show little or no willingness to apply the slightest effort in writing? Why is it common for students to love the fine arts so much that they can observe and analyze a painting for hours, but shut down immediately when using similar observation skills to figure out what's causing a chemical reaction to occur in science class? Futurist Alvin Toffler pointed out that the illiterate of the 21st century will not be these who cannot read or write. It will be those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. Educators must be in the business of teaching critical thinking skills and dispositions in a way that transfers across disciplines.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?